So what is community lawyering? It is really a process of how lawyers use our legal training and skills to work with a group, a community, to solve the issue that they identify. And in the process, hopefully achieve two goals. One is a short-term, near-term goal that is to win over the struggle that they brought to our attention. But in the long term is to build institution in the community, build leadership that will remain in the community so that they can solve problems for themselves without the lawyers in the future. So the skills that we talk about in community lawyering, there are probably three big groups of it. One is community understanding and relationship building. Because we walk into a community, we want to understand what is the history, what is the makeup, what are the challenges, and what are the assets that the community has, so that we can engage them in a full sense. And how do we build a relationship? Recognize people in a neighborhood, in a group, they have existing relationship. And how do we strengthen those relationships and broaden it? Because a lot of times, who you know is what helps get things done. The second thing is engage with community organizers. Organizing is a process, but it's also an end in and of itself. Organized people, organized money are two important factors to success. And the last thing is, how do we have this long-term goal of building indigenous leadership in the community? We call it institution building. Whether you build an organization that has a system to have a democratic structure that would last beyond anybody's existence. I think that's important. How do we build indigenous leadership so that they can solve problems themselves while you're out of the picture? Nowadays, there are a lot of academic research on community law, and there are tons of law review. I have two based on my own kind of learning experience to be a community lawyer and structure the theory of community lawyering. Some of it is how we approach the work itself. How do we recognize our role as lawyer, but also recognize that we don't have all the solutions. We cannot hold ourselves out as the solution. We cannot hold ourselves out as the expert. How do we engage the community? It's an attitudinal issue. How do we change our attitude to engage community in solving the problems that they identify? And I think what is also important is recognizing class, race, age, gender, immigrant status issue. That may be a barrier in how we relate to the community, and it also may affect how the community perceive us, the lawyer. I think those are important kind of underlying issues that we need to recognize ourselves. It was a challenge for me to condense a week-long training into 90 minutes. So I have a lot of slides that I'm not going to show you, but I'll have this available so that you can use it. I'm going to speed all the way. Power mapping, stakeholder analysis. This is kind of academic, but it's fun to do. Oopsie. So organizing. Organized people, organized process, and what is important is organized resources. In a lot of the community lawyering struggle that I was part of, the one very important thing that is not available, we have plenty of people. We don't have money. No money. So unfortunate as it is with hurricane, especially for Harvey, there were actually financial resources that are available that you can go for it if you are organized. And I'm going to defer to Sarah to talk about these government resources or financial resources that become available or has always been available, we just didn't know about it, that you can somehow work with your community to access so that this very fundamental resource is available to you. You can get back to your seat, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I don't even know, did I turn this on? So I want to talk about two things. So one, let's first have some, before we get into the resource question, let's start talking about what do we think the big issues are going to be in this recovery? What are going to be the big injustices that need remedy? Based on your experience so far, your knowledge of other disasters, lack of housing.
Rents have gone up.
Yeah, rising rents, lack of access to affordable housing, quality housing.
People are going to give up.
People are going to give up. What are the policy issues that that are going to need to be corrected, or that you want to influence? Yeah.
Probably how we've identified concentrations of unmet need.
Okay, so where is the unmet need, and is it being met?
Right.
How do you prioritize different communities? Okay. So how does buyout policy play out, and how does it disproportionately affect people who are lower income? Okay. Yeah.
Mitigation projects that protect industry and leave communities vulnerable.
Okay, so the big mitigation money that's coming, who does that benefit? Is it going to benefit existing powerful players, or is it going to invest in historically underinvested communities? All right, a couple more.
Disabled populations, specifically the habitability standard, and what they're having to stay in because their disabilities aren't being accounted for or accommodated for too.
Okay, so lack of visibility of disabled people and under delivery of service. Okay.
And environmental justice. I mean, a lot of these disasters are related to the issues that we're having with our climate. So I think that's part of the mitigation.
Great.
Just kind of piggybacking off of what she said, some of the policies that FEMA has in effect and how much they award in damages sometimes doesn't represent the disabled population in, custom buildings of their home and things that they need to be able to move around and stuff like that.
Okay. Good. Yeah, so it's the county is doing a bond vote on August 25th, the anniversary of Harvey, about infrastructure and mitigation spending. So how does that affect the available resources for other priorities? All right, so I'm not a lawyer, and yet I am on a panel about community lawyering. How many of those problems will be remedied legally in the next year? 0, okay, yeah. So what are some other strategies? What else do you do? You are dealing with vulnerable people who have all kinds of issues that are emblematic of systemic challenges. So what do you do? Okay, so you increase visibility. Encourage people to raise people's voices, yeah? Media, so more communication, visibility, okay. Register people to vote, okay. Would anyone think to engage the government? We talk about power mapping. Who has a lot of power in this recovery? The government, yeah. So for housing recovery specifically, Congress appropriates emergency appropriations after a disaster, and they appropriate them to different federal agencies. So yes, the federal agencies in Washington will get large pots of money, everything from HUD, Housing and Urban Development, but to the Army Corps of Engineers or the Department of Agriculture for disaster SNAP food assistance. So lots of money coming from Congress to the federal agencies, which then make decisions about how the money is distributed among states or other local jurisdictions. And in September, Congress made an emergency appropriation for $7.2 billion for housing recovery specifically. And that was divided among Texas, Florida, and a little bit of money for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico subsequently got an $18 billion appropriation from HUD. But if you are in the role of being an advocate and being in the community, it's useful to know where does that money sit and who holds the power over that money. So in February, HUD published a Federal Register notice that contained lots of rules that as a lawyer you would be well positioned to read. So it's a Federal Register notice on February 9th of 2018 that lays out the requirements for this, for the state of Texas, $5.2 billion, specifically for housing recovery. So if you are interested in housing issues and you think that housing justice is going to be a key feature of what people that you are working with, what they're interested in, the kinds of remedy that they will be seeking, this money is hugely important, and it's a huge source of power. And the decisions that are made about it have the potential to have huge impact on the communities that you're working with. And there are multiple ways to think about justice in that context. Oftentimes, lawyers are dealing with injustice after the fact. How do you remedy injustice that has occurred in the past? But we're in this incredibly creative we are making things right now, rules about how the money will be spent. So in February, HUD put out an announcement that said there's going to be $5.2 billion for Texas, and here's all of the rules that you have to follow, including things on disability, environmental requirements, fair housing requirements. There's all kinds of language in this Federal Register notice that gives community rights. But community has to know about those rights to invoke them. And then in end of April, the state of Texas, which got the $5.2 billion, published its own action plan that said the city of Houston would get $1.15 billion and Harris County would get $1.15 billion that they would get to control, and that the state would run the remaining 2-point-something billion in the rest of the state. So that means that city government in the city of Houston and Harris County now have over $1 billion for housing recovery. And the requirements of that money are that 70% of it must be spent on low and moderate income people. So as you think about the communities that you've described, they are the communities that are supposed to benefit from the vast majority of this money. And I bring this up as an example. I'm less familiar with the Florida context, but the idea that government does have power and that it's worth knowing what powers it has, what resources it has, and what are the processes for influencing the direction of that money. So I run communications and policy for the housing department. I've been there for 5 months, I think. And there's a whole new crew of us that have come in because when you get $1 billion as a city agency, you get to hire more people. And you hire people from the outside and people with the kind of experience that you may not think of when you think of government bureaucrats. But that presents opportunities if you are advocating for historically marginalized communities. And so I would just add to your tool list the idea that you might want to get my phone number and call me up when you are seeing the patterns or observing the kinds of situations that you all described at the beginning. That it's worth getting to know when you think about relationships. Government is not a black box. And it's worth understanding what are the power structures, what are the levers that you might be able to pull, whether that's elected officials, council members, the mayor's staff, people who might respond to political imperatives, whether it's people in an agency, an executive agency like a housing department that might be getting a lot of money that will then have to communicate publicly about what it's doing. It might have to run a community engagement strategy to listen to the community. It might have to publish guidelines about what kinds of programs it's going to run. And that there is a chance in the next year to shape the direction of the recovery in these different places where you're working. So I just add that, I add that to your mix. I think it's interesting that seeking to influence government was not front and center, perhaps, in your mind. And I have throughout my career worked with lots of lawyers. And I find that the lawyers I always enjoy working with the most are those that are willing to think expansively and creatively about how you advance the cause of justice. And that isn't always bringing a lawsuit, it certainly can be, but to really be expansive in your thinking about what your role is and how you can deliver justice to the people that you are seeking to help.
When is the strategic timing to influence the government putting together these policies so that my community, the community that I work with, would be represented?
So we did, when we were first thinking about the $1 billion, I think I'm new to disaster recovery. My career before this was in foreign policy and human rights. So not in affordable housing, not in disaster recovery. But what's interesting to me about coming into disaster recovery is that each one seems to be a reflection on some level of its political environment. There is no playbook. We do not have a kind of guidebook as a federal government about how we do disaster. So each time the rules are different, the appropriation cycle is different, who gets the money is different. So the fact that the city is in this kind of bizarre relationship with the state that is controlling $1 billion+ for housing. So the first thing we did is we called up some organizations that we knew, including some represented around this table, to say, come and talk to us about how we should do community engagement. And we held some meetings. We talked to people that we knew in the community. People called us up and said, this is what we think you should do. And we actually did a fair amount of it. So if you look, I think one of the readings in your Dropbox is a summary that we published of the community engagement for the first round of engagement for Harvey recovery. And so the housing department typically holds, I think, 4 community meetings a year, 2 in the spring and 2 in the fall. And historically, like 5 people show up. And we said, okay, this is not, clearly turnout is not a strength of the housing department. But we know groups that are pretty good at turnout, which range from the Texas Organizing Project or AARP. We partnered with LISC, Go Neighborhoods. So we said, okay, well, why don't we bring the expertise about the federal money and the mapping and all that stuff, and you guys bring people who you know are interested in having a voice in recovery, and we'll kind of run these events together and see if we can get more people engaged in the recovery. And so we ran, I think, 18 public meetings in 6 weeks. And we did an online survey, and we held a teletown hall that had 3,000 people participate in it. And one of the things that we heard from community advocates was you can't just come and get all of our good information because we're experts in our community. We're sharing our expertise with you. You have to tell us what you did with it. So we closed the comment period, I think, on Sunday night, and on Tuesday afternoon, we turned around a 16-page summary of all the things that we had heard and the key issues that Houstonians had raised for us in these community meetings and the online survey and voting. Like, it was pretty interesting. And one of the ways that we're then thinking about, okay, well, what do we do with this? People had huge things to say about drainage. I mean, you were at one of these meetings. Every single meeting, everybody was, their number one priority was home repair and drainage. The housing money, of course, is not for drainage. But I was just in a meeting this week about, okay, what's our strategy for ensuring that the investments in mitigation or infrastructure complement the investments that we're about to make in housing? And so policymaking, I don't know if anyone has worked inside government. Anybody know anything about policymaking? I have like a master's in policy, and it wasn't really until I started working in government that I finally understood what policy was. And it's fundamentally a kind of relational negotiation. There is no sort of lightning bolt that descends on anyone and says, aha, this is your policy. Policy is fundamentally responsive to the political climate, the fact base, what's going on in the world. And the sense of possibility. So one of the roles of advocates is to get to know who's inside making policy, who might be sympathetic to your cause, and to call them up and to poke them and say, what about this? What about that? What are you doing? Can we get a meeting? Okay, we had a meeting. You said you'd do this. What's the next step? When are we meeting again? And that is an incredibly important skill in shaping policy. So it may not be that you get a letter that says, thank you so much for shaping this grand policy, but you'll be able to see your footprints, your fingerprints on what the government does if you learn to be an advocate in this way. So.
Sarah, can you had 18 meetings in 6 weeks. That sounds like you're sort of done getting community input. Can you elaborate on what you just said about the milestones going forward in the spending of the $1 billion, which is not unique to Houston, it's true in Florida, it's true in the rest of the state. So help them think a bit about the stages where ongoing input from the ground is going to help shape not the lightning bolt, but the policy.
Yes. So the first thing that's coming is a needs assessment. One of the things the housing advocates in Texas have really focused on is the inadequacy of FEMA's methodology for calculating the impact of the disaster, particularly on renters. So back in February, we hired a firm, a data analytics firm, to help us conduct a deeper needs assessment. So we have a better, richer understanding of what's actually happening. We'll publish a document that'll be long and in HUD speak, but then we'll also publish some data that I bet is going to be pretty useful to you all. And we'll do that through a couple of partner academic organizations that will be able to interpret this pretty sophisticated modeling that will show the inundation model of the city, income effect on people in different income brackets, renters, owners, all kinds of factors. So that'll come out this summer. At the same time, we're working on program guidelines. So we published already a budget that says we're going to spend $315 million on multifamily. Well, who are we going to prioritize? What kinds of multifamily? What are the requirements for getting access to that money? So we'll run some additional consultations, some expert focus groups about the program guidelines so that people can weigh in on that. We will also publish those for public comment. Lawyers are very good at written comments, so I would encourage you to submit written comments to us on that. And then the programs will start rolling out probably this fall. And there'll be an application process. So the application process will be very important to the people that you're working with. This is a very high stakes internal exercise. How do we make sure that we have an application system that can support the volume and the depth of need that we expect in Houston? But so those are, needs analysis, program guidelines, not for all programs, but at least for the rehab programs that will be the first out of the gate, and then the rollout and the application process.
And you all are going to be so incredibly well positioned to be identifying what works and what needs a fix. And among the many things that I think should be on your plate is sharing that information to identify what that more systemic problem is, and recognizing that, of course, all y'all in City of Houston have Sarah, but that really I implore you to realize that at every level of government, in city, county, state, and federal, there are so many people who go into that work because they want to be of service. So you may be really mad about some policy that has been rolled out that's harming your community. Don't give up, right? You want to. There are going to be people like Sarah who may be in a position to use their authority to make some changes, to change the language, to change the form, and have a cascading impact that comes down to the people that you're working with. So Sarah is this amazing example of the kind of people in government.
Well, thank you. But it's rarely like you call me up and you say this form sucks. You need to change it, and I say, great. Let me wave my magic wand and solve that problem for you. So I think you've got to be, just as you bring a kind of willingness to be in it for the long haul. Policy advocacy in your community lawyering, but policy advocacy is it is a back and forth, and it is you've got to put stuff on the table, you have to make proposals for how things could be done differently. The best proposals are those that respond to the constraints and opportunities, the real constraints and opportunities that government faces. So you want ambitious, smart, practical solutions to the problem that you're identifying.
Right. You don't want to ask Sarah to do something she doesn't have authority to do, which is why you have to be knowledgeable about the rules and regs and statutory authority that they've been given, and make your proposals within those constraints. And you will all remember that among the things that Mercedes told you is the importance of data. Data matters. So as Sarah is saying, you need written proposals. You need to document.
And you come to me and you say, look, this is what we're seeing out in the community. Here are the numbers. Here's the images. And I think that one of the great roles that advocates play is that they expand the limits of what the constraints are. So your media strategy, your raise awareness strategy, you should have in your toolbox a legislative or a lobbying strategy among political leadership.
For those who can do
Yes, sorry. In the broadest sense of the work that, as a core, sort of, as you think broadly about your career as advocates, in the broadest sense. But the idea that communities might want to influence their political leaders, who might take on an issue as a cause or unstick something. Government is often the product of lots of big interacting organizations. And so, oftentimes the housing department itself doesn't have the authority to wave a wand. But if there's a big issue, it's the housing department and, the mayor's office, HUD, there's lots of different characters and players that you can influence.
And one thing you don't want to be in the position is, we never heard from you. We didn't know, right? Sarah is telling you, come call me, show me stuff, and you never follow through. And she didn't hear from you, so didn't know what your concerns are, and come up with policies that you hate, and then you pick up the phone, Sarah, what happened, right? But the challenge is like, bring your community voices to the powers that be. So Sarah, the government is one of the stakeholders, and Sarah covered everything that I skipped to get to this slide. Identify who are the stakeholders. What can they do, and what relationship they have? That's the power mapping. Who you can poke, reach out and touch someone, and they can touch someone to help you influence, the person that has a decision-making power. And what leverage do you have? And that's when, voting is important. You can probably influence, 50,000 votes, or 5,000 for a local election is a tipping point for election results, right? So all the relationships, we have these high-sounding words, stakeholders, power mapping. It's all about relation, right? Personal relationship. How do you mobilize your community relationship to influence these bigger relationships? And I trust that there's probably a parallel or similar process in Florida as well that tackle whatever is the $1 billion that come down from the federal government.
And I think it's hard because there's no playbook. Like, there is no obvious set of, this is what happens next, and this is what happens next, and here's who's supposed to get the money. So it's a skill set that you all are well suited to employ, is to track, where are those key points to influence. Just one follow-up example, though, on this point about sort of influencing those inside. And I think that Mercedes, who you heard from on Monday, is one of the great proponents of this strategy, which is a kind of inside-outside strategy. So sometimes you can call me up and say, here's the issue. What do you think how should we approach this? So someone from an advocacy community called me the other day. They'd come in for a meeting, and they wanted a particular project, and it was a good idea, and we said, great, yes, we're committed. And then because I'm a good bureaucrat, I put it in a public document that said, hey, we're committed to this program. And then she called me up and she said, well, what's the next step? And I said, write me a letter and say, great, we're so glad that you committed to this thing. Now, when's the next meeting? So you can't let it go. You've got to there is no kind of magic wand that you say, great, we got a commitment and now we can step back. You've got to be pushing. And, if there's something that says, yes, we're committed, then you say, great, you're committed. Now show me that you're committed. Provide evidence of that commitment. And that's the process of kind of holding accountable and delivering wins on behalf of constituents, often in the near term, in a way that they might not have to have their rights totally violated before getting justice. So.
Let's see. So again, it's back to this thing. Even reaching out to Sarah is still relationship first, and then the issue later, right? You have to have the relationship before you can bring up these issues, and then build on the relationship to try to help your community get what they need, right? And in the community itself, it's the same thing, right? You don't want to have only one point person that you can relate to. You want to have a group of people that has some kind of structure that you can relate to, so that you know which direction you can take from the community. So there are all these stages of organizing. You'll have the PowerPoint, don't worry. So I thought this is really cool. So leadership qualities of organizer. Who makes a good organizer? I really like the first point, cold anger. What does that mean? That you don't just fly off the handle and walk away. Someone who can contain the anger and be analytical and engage the issue afterwards. How to use your anger and the energy that comes from it to engage is the important part. And in the immigration world, this is something that is very, very challenging currently. Every week, sometimes every other day, there's something new that attack or take away immigrants' rights. And when I meet with my staff, I always talk about that, what is it, 4 stages of grieving? So first you're angry, and then you're in denial, hoping that it will change. Somehow after you sleep overnight, then it will change. It doesn't. I don't remember what's the third thing about stages of grieving. Denial, and what happened? Bargaining. Yeah, 5. Oh, geez. Right. So I don't want people to get to the acceptance, right? So I would kind of engage people at the anger stage. So what do we do to fight back, right? I want people to fight back because if we don't, then we are acceptance. It's not a good thing. It's not acceptable, right? So how to envision, this is what Robert Kennedy said at one point. Don't take the world as it is. Think of it as what it should be. And that's what we are trying to do every day and in your role as community lawyers in the community. What is not good? We should think about what should be and figure out how we can get there. It may not be in the next year or the next 10 years or sometimes even in a lifetime, but it's good to think about what should be. And that is really what kind of inspired this community lawyering practice. You don't always win, but how do you interpret less than a winning solution outcome? And how do you continue to use that to build the community, to engage the community is important. There's a little bit of organizer in community lawyers, but I would always say that I'm not an organizer. I don't know organizing. But if an organizer tells me to do the organizing action, I would do it, but I'm not an organizer. Willingness to take risk, no pain, no gain, right? So just accepting what is, then you can't really move for any changes. Being curious, being imaginative. Ego is not to have an ego, but how do you recognize that you have this ego and put it aside so that it's not preventing you from doing things? Right? We all have ego, otherwise we won't be in this room. But but how do you recognize it and say, hey, this is not helpful. So organizing is always action, right? Campaigns takes forever from beginning to actually some kind of solution. Like I said earlier, right? You have this big, tenant organizing, winning, protecting affordable housing. That's going to take years to get to that point. How do you keep people engaged throughout the process? So you could be helping people get the, broken faucet fixed. That's an action item. That's a little win. Organizers continuously have action so that they can engage the group of people. And celebrate little victories is also important because otherwise people are like, I can't wait for the big, win. What, it's going to take years. And then there's this one iron rule that I was taught by an organizer. Never do for others what they can do for themselves. We want to recognize people have agency in how they do things, how they engage life. What they can do, encourage them to do it, support them in the process, but never do it for them. because that is not very helpful. And then there's one very important part of engaging in community lawyering is developing leadership. That stays with the community after you finish what you are engaged to do. I worked in legal services for quite some time, and I have lived through all the funding changes, all the restrictions. So now it's awesome. We have, legal services lawyer going into the community to help with this recovery process. But what can be given can also be taken. So we, for legal services community, we started with 1980, right? There is major funding cut for legal services program, and then subsequently imposed restriction that, if you receive $1 of federal legal services corporation money, all your monies are restricted, and you cannot represent people who don't have immigration status, and it is still the world that we live in now in legal services, right? So that cut off a whole bunch of people from people that you can represent. Right? So that's why building leadership in the community that stay with the community is important. I always say that have an exit plan. Whatever that you start doing, you enter into the community, have an exit plan so that things don't fall apart. Things that you work so hard to build don't disappear when you step out of the process. And this is one of the goals of community lawyering. Build leadership that stay with the community, that will remain strong in the community. How do we do that, right? Create opportunities. For example, we want to reach Sarah to influence how this policy is being developed. You can sit at your desk and do all the research, do all the mapping, all you want. But you can also engage your community because they have knowledge about the place where they live. For example, I did a traffic study to oppose a major hospital development, right? And they have an expert to do the traffic study that count like 1,000 cars going down the street. It's no problem. Building a 500-car garage has no traffic impact. We engaged the community, the youth. We did that too. Get up 6 o'clock in the morning in the community, assign people at 8 intersections, and have this clicker to count how many cars go left, turn right, make illegal U-turns. And we create a community-generated traffic study that counted 3 times more cars. And that was used to present to the, the Environmental Protection Agency to say that this development is going to have all these traffic impacts, and the developer study is disingenuous. And that, caused the study to be thrown back to the developer. Little things. But community knows this because they live there. They know how many cars make illegal U-turns and, double park, and they know the theater goers party until 2 o'clock in the morning. And that's not the peak, peak time traffic would tell you. So how engage the community in every single step of the way is important. And that is a process of building leadership. You can probably read all this. So lawyers are troublemakers. So it is important to recognize some of these things. You may even see yourself in this list, but you don't need to admit it. Try, not to be the solution. We don't have a magic wand to solve, community problems. Engage the community in coming up with a solution that they want and can live with and can benefit from. And being the expert. So what is important is how to teach people to become expert. Like I said, they have indigenous knowledge in the community, but you can also point them to places where they can find information that they don't already have. Google is available to everyone. You can Google as well as the next person. Teach the community how to do those kind of community research. Being the charismatic leader, at press conference, I'm the speaker because I'm the lawyer. But what is important is to have the community people to be the speaker, to be the person interviewed by the media, to talk about their stories. No one's interested in hearing the lawyer's story. And important is that litigation can be powerful too, and it's necessary sometimes, but it could also be disempowering because litigation is the lawyer's game. It's very difficult to engage community folks in part of the litigation. Win or lose, all this discovery, all these answers, complaint is all your fancy writing, right? The community cannot, find it very difficult to participate in. So, one thing that I did was by trying to learn about the community, I also learned to be a historian for the community. Put together the story. This is in Boston Chinatown that I worked very closely with for many years. I helped put together the story that they all know pieces of. But I put it all together and tell it back to them so that they have the whole story that they can use to talk about the community when they meet with the city officials, when they go to candidate forum to challenge all these candidates for position. This is what the community research would actually support you to provide the information and tell it back to the community so that they have something to use. The law is not the be-all and end-all. A lot of things happen outside of the legal realm, and how to be imaginative and creative, how to use a public comment process to generate important things for your community, and how do you use that to engage the community. If there's a public hearing, you can show up to represent the voices of the community, but you can also bring 50 people to come to the public hearing, and they talk about what they feel about certain policies, and it's so much more powerful. I have clients say, I don't speak English, I can't be there. That's okay, I bring an interpreter. So when you work with clients who are limited English proficient, that is your bridge to bring interpreter so that they can have a voice. Lastly, I'm not saying that community lawyers should never use the law or litigation. Sue if we must. And this is just some examples of some of the land use struggle that I engaged in. ACLU has been really instrumental in helping stop certain things in the last couple of months. So lawsuit has its role. We want to be the lawyer of the community, the lawyer of the first resort for the community, but we also want to hold out lawsuit as the last resort, as a tool to solve the community's problem. So this is like speed talking. I hope you get something out of it.
Zenobia, thank you so much for sharing what I think is a really big idea about community lawyering and how that can fit, how that needs to fit in to the way you roll out your fellowship, along with some of a taste of the nitty-gritty parts of implementing it. And I refer you to the full PowerPoint slide, which will be in the Dropbox. And thank you, Sarah, for illustrating the ways in which this style of being a lawyer and engaging the community, in fact, influences how policy develops and gets implemented, and the potential for this inside-outside game where there's this ongoing opportunity to be lifting the voices of your clients in ways that will ultimately affect the power play and that has direct impact on the people that you're trying to serve. So, big round of applause.